My name is Jordan Schwartz. For those of you who don't know me, I've been at this firm since we started a little over 10 years ago now. And one of the things I specialize in are these types of trade secret and non-compete matters. Darius and I actually have worked together on a few of these types of cases. And they're very interesting. They're high pressure, but they can cost you as a company a lot of money. So what Darius and I are going to try to do today is give you at least some pointers to potentially avoid some of these lawsuits and things to be aware of, essentially to keep your company, to try to limit your exposure to liability going forward. Darius, do you want to introduce yourself for a minute?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Darius Ronnie Shukla. I'm an associate here. I've been here for about 3 years, and looking forward to explaining a little bit about trade secrets and what your company can do to safeguard them and potentially try and litigate if they have been misappropriated and they've been exposed.
Great. Thank you very much, Darius. What we'll do today is I will start just kind of giving you the general current landscape with everything to do with non-compete agreements, because non-compete agreements are inextricably, tied to trade secrets, and there's been so much movement with non-compete law in the past year. So I want to make sure you have the correct information. Some people may have been paying attention a year ago, think they have the correct information, and they might be using outdated information. So basically, I'll spend probably the first half, maybe the first third of the presentation on non-compete agreement issues. And then Darius will take over and do the remaining portion, more honing in specifically on the trade secret aspect. But to start with non-competes, I always just think this cartoon is kind of endearing, so I like this cartoon. But let's talk about non-compete agreements. Most of you probably know this, but just to reiterate, what is a non-compete agreement? It's a restrictive covenant that's designed specifically to prevent your employees from competing with you, for a specific period of time, both while they're employed with you, of course, and then specifically after the employment has ended. The common prohibitions are working for a competitor, of course, working for a company that maybe isn't fully a competitor, but they develop competing products, starting a company that competes with the former employer, or really just working with any sort of company that could potentially threaten you as the current or former company. The bullet point I have there in the middle is that typically a non-compete agreement requires the employee to enter into it before beginning work. I should have written there, typically the best practice is to require the employee to enter into it before beginning work. It's not always the case that happens. And sometimes it's the employer's fault. They just didn't think of it at the beginning. Or sometimes the employee's job duties change. The company is acquired. So many things that can happen that would require you to do it later on. And really, if you have the choice, you want to have the non-compete agreement execute at the beginning of the original employment agreement, or if you don't have the employment agreement, just when the offer is accepted. That way, the acceptance of the offer would be considered consideration, and it's really just cut and dry. There aren't too many cases that would find that isn't the case. I mean, you could give a little extra money just as additional consideration for the non-compete, but that's usually not necessary at the inception of the employment. But the question of whether there's adequate consideration becomes much more complicated after the employment. So let's say someone's working for your company for 5 years, and then you say, you know what, Darius, you're just working with a lot of confidential information. We're going to have you sign a non-compete. Well, that's all well and good, but we have to do something to ensure that there's adequate consideration so that the non-compete agreement is valid. It's possible, depending on the state you're in, that just me saying to Darius, you know what, for your consideration, we'll continue to employ you. We won't fire you. That might be adequate consideration. Before doing that, make sure that is adequate consideration in your state, because in many states, simple continued employment is not adequate consideration. You might, otherwise then have to say, well, here's a non-compete agreement. We'll also give you a bonus of $10,000, or we'll give you a raise. It might not necessarily have to be monetary. I could say, Darius, now with your new responsibilities, we're giving you a new title. You have increased relationships, you have increased access to customers, something of that effect. That all could be potentially consideration as well. But let's just not forget about the fact that you do need to give increased consideration. You cannot just have someone sign and then just assume that you're fine, that they signed a non-compete agreement 5 years into your employment, and then 3 years later, when there's a termination situation, you just assume that the non-compete is valid. So there's three things that really must be considered in order for a non-compete to be valid. The first one is what I just explained. It's got to be supported by consideration at the time it is signed, not just at the time the employee is hired. Second, the non-compete agreement must protect a legitimate business interest of the employer. And third, it must be reasonable in scope, geography, and duration. And as you all can imagine on this call, these are the 3 bullet points where the litigation happens. What is meant by adequate consideration, we just discussed. What is meant by legitimate business interest, and what is actually reasonable in either scope, geography, or duration. So the second one I mentioned, the legitimate business interest. Regardless of how well in a non-compete agreement, courts will not enforce it just because you want to stop competition. You need, as an employer, you need to identify what is a legitimate business interest that the non-compete agreement seeks to protect. While courts, they've been a little reticent to define exactly what it means to be a legitimate interest. They give examples, which I'll give you momentarily. But what they do a little easier in the case law, and they're less hesitant to do, is make clear what is not a legitimate business interest. And it is not just merely protecting you as an employer from general competition. Employers do not have an interest in preventing employees from using their own wherewithal and their own general knowledge, skill, even if that's been acquired by the employee through training or experience during their employment with you. That is not something you can protect. There is a slight exception to that, something called the inevitable disclosure doctrine, saying, well, we have to prevent you from competing because you've gained so much high sensitivity knowledge, highly sensitive knowledge, or so much, information regarding our trade secrets that you will inevitably disclose that information if you go to an employer, a different company. If you leave us and go to a different company. Some states enforce the inevitable disclosure doctrine, some states don't. That's a highly specific situation. But aside from that, courts really will just apply a totality of circumstances review to determine whether you, as the employer, have identified a legitimate business interest. As I said, the courts throw out a lot of examples. Clearly, the top one is trade secrets, and that's why I said these are intertwined. That's why Darius is going to spend 40 minutes talking to you about trade secrets. But there are other legitimate interests as well. Intellectual property, customer list, that's always a big one. Are you taking a customer list? Do you have a customer list? Have you, and Darius might touch on this, have you misappropriated a customer list? Have you sent an email from your company email account to your personal email account with a list of customers that you can then contact when you leave? That's why you have a non-compete, so you can't do that. Even goodwill with customers, knowledge of your specific business practices, methods, profit margins, costs. Those are all potential legitimate business interests. These are all highly fact specific. And what you want to do in your non-compete agreement is, as much as possible, be specific about what you are protecting. There's always a meeting of the minds is the best thing you can do, so that both you and the employee are on the same page. If the employee leaves and then you have to send a cease and desist letter and or sue the employee, it would be the best if you can point to a document he signed saying what he specifically would not do. And I'll talk about a little bit about that in a little while. But that is really the quick overview of what's a legitimate business interest. The next bullet point, if you remember, was really the final one, in addition to adequate consideration and legitimate business interest, is the non-compete reasonable? And another word to look at it the other way is it overbroad? And scope, geography, and duration, they're all looked at together. Let's say the duration is 1 year. Typically, a court would find that reasonable. But if it's 1 year and then the geography is everywhere in the world, so basically the employee can't work for an entire year anywhere, a court possibly might not find that reasonable. Whereas if it's 1 year and within a 15-mile radius, most likely a court would find that reasonable. And you could kind of look at that both ways. If you have a longer duration, you probably want a smaller geographic limitation, and vice versa. Generally, courts do find somewhere between 1 to 2 years is reasonable. Again, it depends on the facts. I've seen some where up to 5 years are reasonable. And again, I've seen 1 year that a court has said, no, it's not reasonable. It should be pushed back to 6 months because it's too large of a geographic limitation. Geography has changed over the years. When I was starting my practice, courts cared more about geographic limitations. Now, with so many practices, being nationwide or worldwide, or not mattering where you're located because it's an internet company, sometimes the geographic limitation isn't as important. And then the scope. And that's what that means is really the scope of the job. I keep on using Darius as an example, although lawyers are not subject to non-competes, possibly because we wrote the rules. I'm not really sure. I mean, the actual given explanation is clients should have the right to choose their lawyer, and we shouldn't be able to essentially bargain away that right by having our law firm prevent us from working somewhere else, and thus then the client not being able to choose us. But there are other professions where I think an equally similar justification should apply, and it doesn't. So I'm a little cynical that lawyers just carved out this for themselves. But let's just say it was reasonable. It was lawful. It would make sense if I said to Darius, you can't compete with the other employment law firm down the block as an employment lawyer because you're just going to try to take all of our firm's clients and service them there. But if you want to go and work at that firm as, we call it the janitor rule, just as a janitor, I really can't say no to that because there's no reason that's going to harm um, our company. He's not using the same information. He's not soliciting clients. He's doing a totally different job. So that's why it typically is not, um, you can't just stop someone from working for another entity. You have to stop them. You can only stop them from competing against you at a different entity. Um, and the thing that I don't think I've written in these slides, it's interesting. Some states have something called a blue pencil rule, and some states don't. And what that means is if you end up suing someone for potentially breaching a non-compete, there's essentially two things a judge can do. They can either agree with you and stop the, I'm sorry, three things. They can either agree with you and stop the employee from working at the new company. They can disagree, say you're wrong, and keep on allowing the employee to work. Or they can do something in the middle, which is called blue penciling, which is basically cross out the part of the agreement they don't think is valid and write in the terms they think are valid. So, for example, if there was a year non-compete, the judge could say, you know what, a year sounds too harsh. I don't think Darius should be out of work for a year, but I do think you need some time to, you just don't want him going across the street tomorrow and trying to get your client. So how about I am going to change it to a 6-month non-compete? That gives you time to speak to your clients, try to get your ducks in a row, and that's not too harsh on Darius. So you want to be aware if you're in a blue pencil jurisdiction. Non-competes in general are starting to be a little bit less, let me say it a different way, are starting to be a little more frowned upon at the federal level. I'll talk for just a minute, in a couple minutes, about the FTC non-compete rule that was struck down last year. But even with that struck down, and even with the new administration, federal law is just still, people are starting to be a little bit skittish from a federal perspective about non-compete law. At the end of the day, that doesn't really matter that much because non-competes has always been a state law issue. But just know there, bipartisan support. There's been bipartisan support the last couple of years for curtailing non-competes. So states are just getting more. The trend is for non-competes to fall out of favor from the federal level and more robust state level restrictions. Right now, there's only 4 states that ban non-competes outright. Most people know California does. People might not know that Oklahoma, North Dakota, and Minnesota, somewhat recently, Minnesota and North Dakota, I believe, have banned non-competes outright. A bunch of states are starting to limit their use with salary thresholds. DC, I believe, if you make less than about 155,000, I don't believe you can be subject to a non-compete. Other states are similar, but they're it's a much lower salary threshold. Maryland has it where I live, and I think Maryland, the threshold's only about 47,000. Illinois, it's I think around 75,000. The thing that I think is pretty interesting is I've always been surprised that healthcare professionals, as opposed to lawyers, could be subject to non-competes, but more and more states are banning doctors, veterinarians, and some other healthcare from being subject to non-competes now. Pennsylvania, Maryland, and I believe Louisiana just recently put a ban on healthcare professionals. Other states are, trying to institute similar type legislation, either to ban them outright, ban non-competes outright, or at least institute salary thresholds. I know New York, Maine, and Rhode Island have all had legislation the past couple of years. And you'll see I just have a couple examples of state courts here. Delaware recently voided a non-compete that was overly broad and unfairly imposed. Pennsylvania, it lacks sufficient consideration. The Delaware one is important because a lot of companies are incorporated in Delaware and have Delaware choice of law provision, and Delaware is really getting stricter with non-competes. So you want to be careful if you are a company that enforces non-competes that maybe Delaware might not be the place to do it. One thing I just want to mention that, is that I'm not going to get to in detail here, but you want to consider instead of doing a broad non-compete, might it make sense to just have a non-solicitation? And that can mean two things. That can mean prohibiting your employees once they leave from soliciting your customers and your clients, and or prohibiting them from soliciting your current employees. That's also called an anti-rating provision. Sometimes those are much less scrutinized by the courts, and to have an agreement that prevents an employee from taking your current employees and prevent them from taking your customers, that might be all you need, depending, on your industry and things of that nature. You could also have an NDA. You could also have, agreement that, of course, prevents trade secrets from being shared and disclosed, some sort of confidentiality, trade secret protection. But that's just something you want to consider. Let me move forward pretty quickly here so I get to Darius. Just quickly, hopefully you all know that there was the law and there was the proposed law that the FTC instituted in 2024. It would have banned virtually all non-competes, especially employment non-competes, and even some sale of business. It would have made it retroactive. Basically, non-competes would have been a thing of the past. But that was blocked by some courts in Texas and Florida. And now, under the Trump administration, it's unlikely that the FTC will follow through with its appeal. Also, the National Labor Relations Board was opposing non-competes, but the main general counsel who was opposing it has now been terminated. It's unclear whether or not this termination will fully stay or not. It's in the courts right now, whether the termination was lawful. But for now, from our perspective, it seems like the federal efforts to invalidate non-competes, for now have failed. Nonetheless, there still is, as I mentioned, some sort of trend against non-competes from a federal perspective. My last two slides here just deal with hiring employees with non-compete agreements. You just want to be careful here because if an employee violates a non-compete agreement, they might get sued. But if you hire them, you are almost definitely going to get sued as the new employer with deeper pockets. So you want to take reasonable steps to protect your business from interfering with competitors' restrictive covenants. So when you're hiring someone, when you're in the process of hiring, make sure you ask the person whether they are subject to a non-compete or some other type of restrictive covenant. You want to see a copy of it if they are. And you, as the employer, want to insist on full compliance to the extent you can. If you're able to hire this person, but just not have them compete, you want to make sure to take steps to do that. Because if you get a cease and desist letter, you want to be able to assert that you took steps to prevent them from competing. If you can't hire them, you want to know that too, and you want to wait until the applicable deadline. And you want to instruct the applicant that you, as the new company, expects them to comply with their former employer's agreements. You do not want to be tortiously interfering with their old company and or in any way pressuring them or encouraging them to breach their non-compete agreement. That will only result in money, cost, and difficult hardship for you going forward. Even if the employer is annoyed and very mad at their old employee, again, they're going to sue you. Maybe they'll sue both of you, and then you might even have to pay for the legal defense of your new employee's counsel. So you really just want to be smart in this regard. And as I mentioned, if you hire this person, you want to review the restrictive covenants and make sure everyone understands how to comply. If there has to be some sort of wall of what they can and can't do and who they can and can't talk to, you have to enforce that. Have the new employees create a comprehensive customer list that the employees service while at the former employer, or about whom the employee has confidential information, so that that list is not shared. It is not so then you can try to solicit those customers again, unless you are able to, unless there's not a valid agreement. Then by all means, you can go ahead to try to get a business advantage. But what I'm trying to counsel you here is not to get a business advantage, but not to be doing anything that will potentially violate the law and get you in trouble. As I said, create the ethical wall between the business that the employee service at the former employer. And yeah, you're avoiding allegations that you are trying to help this employee flip customers from the old company to you. And finally, just the last thing I'll say, these slides are about hiring employees with restrictive covenants. But if you're firing an employee with a restrictive covenant, you do want to let the employee know that, unfortunately, we're sorry to see you go, but we are hereby reminding you that you are subject to either a non-solicit or a non-compete. And we expect you to honor that. You don't want to threaten the employee. You kind of hate if you're firing them to have this conversation as well. Or maybe it's they're leaving. It's either way. If they're leaving on their own or if they're firing, if you have a valid non-compete, you do want to remind them that they need to abide by that non-compete. That is maybe they forgot, maybe they're trying to be, shady or shifty, but just having that conversation could go a long way. And on that note, let me hand this over to Darius so he could start talking about specifically trade secrets.
Hey everyone, this is Darius. So for the second half of the presentation, we're going to dive into, as Jordan mentioned, trade secrets. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what trade secrets are and how they're legally defined. Then we'll shift to the real world risks to those trade secrets, delving into insider threats and cybersecurity lapses. And finally, we'll talk about how to protect those secrets proactively and what legal tools are available to you if something does happen to go wrong. So the first question is what is a trade secret? What are trade secrets? At a threshold level, a trade secret is any information that's not generally known and gives a business a competitive advantage. There's two key characteristics in this. The information is confidential, and it has independent economic value because it's kept secret. Not everything confidential qualifies as a trade secret. Importantly, you must take reasonable steps to protect that information. When it comes to courts want to see a real effort to maintain that secrecy. And most states, when it comes to determining how to define a trade secret, follow what's known as the Uniform Trade Secrets Act, which sets out the legal standards for what counts as a trade secret and how they're protected under civil law. Now that we have defined what a trade secret is, the next question is how do courts actually determine if something qualifies? When it comes to determining it in terms of in a court, whether something qualifies as a trade secret is not necessarily automatic. Instead, it's usually a fact-specific legal inquiry. Courts evaluate a number of factors, including how carefully and consistently a company treats the information as confidential. This could mean limiting access, labeling it clearly, or requiring signed agreements. And courts will also look at how valuable the information is to both the business and potential competitors, plus how much effort or cost went into creating or compiling the trade secret and how easily it could be obtained by others. Could it be reverse engineered, for instance? In short, if the information is confidential, valuable, and protected, then there's a chance, depending on that fact-specific inquiry, that it may qualify as a trade secret. Now, in the next slide, I'll walk through a few examples of what trade secrets actually look like in practice. At a tangible level, here are a few real-world examples of what trade secrets are. Got customer lists, manufacturing processes, strategic plans, pricing models. We're thinking about things that give your company an edge that your competitors would love to get their hands on. And notably, it's not necessarily just technical data, which is what we tend to think of when we think of trade secrets. Training manuals and testing procedures can qualify as well. The key to those types of material is that they're not public and that they hold economic value because they are specifically kept confidential. I was looking for a few examples of how trade secrets can come up in court. And an interesting example I found was a 2013 case. There were two scientists who were charged with conspiring to steal proprietary U.S. agricultural seed technology. The scientists worked for a Kansas-based biopharmaceutical company that invested millions of dollars in developing these seeds. Evidence showed that the scientists had taken them home, kept them at home, and then passed them on to a delegation whose luggage was later found to contain those same seeds. The seeds were ultimately judged to be trade secrets and proprietary in court. And part of the evidence that the company put on to demonstrate that they're proprietary was that there were just 3 individuals at the company that had access to the seeds alone. That level of secrecy, that level of keeping the seeds away from the entire rest of the company that put millions of dollars into developing them was really powerful evidence to demonstrate that they were, in fact, trade secrets. So as you can see, the more valuable the secret, the greater the risk that it'll be targeted by competitors or threats. So in this slide, we're going to talk a little bit about threats to trade secrets and proprietary information and what they look like. This was an interesting poll I found. It comes from a recent industry survey asking company leaders about what they consider to be the biggest threats for their trade secrets. No surprise here, the first one in this day and age is cybersecurity weaknesses. That can look like gaps in cybersecurity, be it phishing, poor password practices, or unpatched systems. The technical weaknesses that are really significant gateway to trade secret loss. Right behind that is employees. Employees can sometimes be malicious, sometimes it can be accidental, like emailing a client list to their personal account for convenience and then that being stolen or hacked or accidentally left out. Following that, there's competitive intelligence, competitors trying to gather inside knowledge through recruiting, social engineering, or former employees even. And then vendors and contractors aren't immune from being a threat. They can be a blind spot sometimes. If they're not bound by strong confidentiality clauses or trained on your policies, they may become an unintentional leak point to your business. Corporate espionage still occurs, be it foreign, be it domestic, not unlike the seed example I gave in the prior slide. These are direct efforts to steal proprietary information, and they remain a real concern to some businesses. And finally, particularly interesting, given this presentation, one of the really interesting threats to trade secrets is that just failing to categorize intangible assets as trade secrets means that if you don't classify and protect the trade secrets, the courts aren't going to either, and they won't be protected. So when you're looking at this, I think the bottom line is that there's internal and external risks, and they're almost equally weighted. So both of them need to be considered and require a proactive strategy in protecting your trade secrets. When I was looking at that list, I think you can sort of categorize those threats in 3 categories: insider threats, modern workforce risks, and resource-based threats. Resource-based threats, excuse me. And those aren't mutually exclusive. I think if you think about them, they're probably 3 circles in a Venn diagram that each overlap with each other. And what we'll do in this section is go into a little bit more detail about what each one is. Insider threats are still, you can see from the last slide, the #1 risk for trade secrets, be it employees, contractors, or executives with access to sensitive information who, again, could either intentionally or accidentally compromise it. And as part of the insider threats, be it intentional or accidental, there are physical security and cybersecurity considerations. Physical lapses could look like an unlocked filing cabinet. Cybersecurity could be credential theft or weak network protection. Similarly, there's the modern workforce risks and resource-based threats, which can fold into the insider threat, and vice versa. Modern workforce risks look like remote work, personal devices, employees not even realizing they're accidentally exposing sensitive data, and resource-based threats look like downsizing, layoffs, underfunded IT security departments creating blind spots. So now that we've identified these threats at a 30,000 foot level, we'll look a little deeper about where they come from and what they actually look like in practice. For insider threats, there's really 3 ways that an insider threat's going to come about in an intentional perspective. There's a thief, an individual who is the classic insider threat, someone who sees an opportunity to walk out the door with trade secrets, whether to sell, use in a new job, or even start a competing business. Relating to that, there's a competitor who is a present competitor. They want your future. The threat comes in the form of a recruiter or a rival company using employees to either gain market share, talent, or brand insights. The goal isn't necessarily to destroy your company, but perhaps they want to outmaneuver you, get a foothold in a market they're not in. And finally, and related, there's an adversary, an individual, be it a fired employee, perhaps someone with a bigger agenda, or maybe part of an organized effort where their goal isn't necessarily to steal your information, but to sink your business. Now, when we're talking about insider threats in the employee context, it's easy to jump straight to cybersecurity, but in reality, there's a lot of red flags that are personal and behavioral and things that we can notice a long time before a system is compromised. And these are the personal factors. It might look like a disgruntled employee or someone with a poor performance record who becomes more likely to act out or mishandle sensitive information. You'd want to keep out for folks who think that the rules don't apply to them, that an above the rules attitude is obviously going to be highly detrimental to protecting your trade secrets or any proprietary information. When someone bypasses their supervisor or goes directly to leadership, this is indicative of, on a baseline level, conflict, but as well as that, a lack of trust. And similarly, another factor to look out for, an indicator of a potential employee insider threat, or someone who frequently expresses they're underappreciated or conducts repeated security violations or has odd work patterns, like showing up late at night or on weekends. These are concerning behaviors that can be demonstrative of a higher risk for misconduct. But like I said, behavioral sides are just one side of the puzzle. Now we'll look at the technology side, where insider threats often leave digital breadcrumbs. While personal behavior can raise red flags, technology is obviously going to tell the real story, and that's because digital activity always leaves a trail. And notably, with the right monitoring in place, it can give you an early warning sign before a breach occurs. These are some of the insider threat indicators that technology might show. Tech activity can often reveal what behavior tries to hide, i.e. sudden changes in email, sudden changes in access patterns, or device use that wouldn't be obvious when observing the individual, but looking at their network or their computer would demonstrate. And it's really going to be just one small thing. Typically, there could be one small anomaly, but when they're combined, they're going to tell a bigger story. Think of someone who suddenly has a lot of increased non-business related activities and increased foreign IP activity, and is also encrypting emails. Each one of those on their own isn't necessarily going to be demonstrative of some type of insider threat, but together, particularly with a change of behavior, could be a red flag for suspicious activity in real time. The shift to remote and hybrid work has obviously brought flexibility, but it's also introduced these serious new risks when it comes to trade secrets. So in this slide, I want to talk a little bit about these. And you can also see how these relate to insider threat and the insider threats we just discussed. An interesting stat I found was that nearly 50% of employees with bring their own device policies report breaches. That's because home networks and personal devices aren't going to be protected by company firewalls. They're usually going to be completely distinct. Similarly, when you have the blurred personnel and work lines, it can be a little bit difficult for companies to track their data, making data misuse a lot more difficult to spot. And employees, despite training, might use unsecure apps or accidentally share confidential information. And finally, related to what Jordan discussed, departing employees with access on personal devices are always going to be a concern, and are certainly going to be a growing concern as there's more and more information that can be accessed on those devices. So beyond how and where people are working, related to that, the other growing challenge we want to go into again is internal resource strain, resource-based threats, as I discussed at the beginning. The essence of this slide is really that when teams shrink, when expertise shrinks, your risk grows. And unless you're proactive about plugging those gaps, you're going to have bigger risks. With smaller teams and downsizing, it's going to stretch your resources thinner, and it's going to weaken the defenses. The reason for this practically is that oversight breaks down. If there's less managers or less IT staff, it means that there's fewer people watching for issues, and there's fewer people with the knowledge to look for those issues. It means that access might go unmanaged. Again, when employees leave, it's easy to forget to cut off the access to sensitive data if the managers or IT staff that would have done so are either not present or overburdened with other responsibilities. So after looking at all these steps, the next step is kind of what can you do about it? So what I'm going to do now is sort of walk through a few practical steps to safeguard trade secrets before they potentially walk out the door. So one of the biggest missteps that companies can make is assuming that everyone knows what needs to be protected at a company. Trade secrets are often buried in day-to-day operations and overlooked. Like I talked about earlier on, there's obviously the quintessential trade secret, the hidden formula, the secret sauce, but that's not always the case. You want to think about your most valuable processes, formulas, or relationships, and then ask who has access, who tracks that access, and how is it stored. And this can be a people and process issue too. You want systems that not only protect information, but also make the employees aware of what's sensitive. And as time goes on, trade secret protection is something you're going to have to revisit as your business grows, your team changes, new tools or platforms are introduced, and as a result, your trade secrets themselves might change. And then finally, when it comes to disposing of documents, don't forget about what happens after information is no longer needed. Poor document disposal is one of the easiest ways that a company can lose control of sensitive data. When it comes to kind of maintaining control of your information, the NDAs are your front line of defense, especially with regard to employees, and that's especially when trade secrets involved. But like a lot of the subjects we've discussed today, they're only effective as they're thoughtfully written. Courts are going to look at whether the agreement is reasonable, and that's not going to be a fixed standard. The more tailored the NDA is to your business, the better chance of it has of holding up. The more thoughtful and conscientious you are about those agreements, and the more you're willing to not use boilerplate language that likely won't cut it, the more likely you're going to have success. So what you want to consider when drafting non-disclosure agreements is being specific about what counts as confidential, so there's no ambiguity to the employee or a judge. Consider that NDAs don't always have to just protect data. Like Jordan mentioned, they can also address things like soliciting clients or poaching staff after someone leaves. And finally, remember that these agreements don't necessarily just protect your company. They're also demonstrative to regulators and courts that you took steps to protect the sensitive information. So moving to the next slide, the important part of this is that you want to make sure you're training your employees about implementing these NDAs and handling trade secrets. Periodic training is really, really key to everything we've discussed today. Employees can't protect what they don't know is confidential, and regular training ensures they understand what's sensitive and how to handle it. And this training isn't just for new hires. You really want it to be periodic. And consider ongoing refreshers that can help reinforce expectations and keep security top of mind. And like I said, things can change. Staff can change, your trade secrets can change, your systems can change. So it's really important to connect your policies to the real world risks in these refreshers and make sure that your employees know why this matters and it's not just rules for the sake of rules. When the employees are trained well, they can become an active part of your protection strategy, not just potential sources of risk. Now, a second part of maintaining your trade secrets is considering the physical security of your work site. We've talked a lot about cybersecurity, and we'll talk about it more. But from a defensive perspective, regardless of the adversary, be it a malevolent employee or simply a careless one, it's really important not to overlook physical security, because that relates to digital protection and can be where it breaks down. Things you might want to consider looking at this list, are controlling who can enter sensitive areas, whether that's using badges, locked doors, or having clear visitor protocols depending on your business. And tracking movement, logs, cameras, and ID systems can help identify unusual access patterns. And then when it comes to the physical documents themselves, consider marking them and monitoring them, being sure that they're stored securely and disposed of properly. And just as with cybersecurity and just how I discussed before, it's really important to empower employees to speak up if they see suspicious behavior on site. When it comes to cybersecurity, again, this is, the physical workspace is really, really important, but it's just half the equation, especially today. With so much work happening online, digital security really has to be intentional and layered. Cybersecurity isn't necessarily just your firewalls and antivirus software. It's also considering the employee and personnel aspect, knowing who's in your system, what they're doing, and whether they belong there. You could consider routine hygiene matters like password changes, multi-factor authentication, limiting access based on actual need. Using those steps together can stop problems before they start. And one of the biggest threats looking at this list is really what you don't know, like who hasn't updated outdated software? Are there open access points? Are there bulk data downloads that no one noticed? So your team needs to know how to respond and what to respond to, being a suspicious email, a phishing attempt, or real-time breach. And like I said before, that means training, clear processes and response plans that we'll look at later that don't live in a drawer and are constantly being refreshed. And then finally, when it comes to sending sensitive materials electronically, make sure to use digital fingerprints or watermarking so you know where the information ends up and making sure that you're being considerate about paying attention to your materials and where it goes. Like I said, despite all of the previous methods we discussed, it's really important and they don't really work unless your company has a clear plan for managing trade secrets, especially during employee transitions or if something happens. Ideally, that plan is going to spell out who has access, who and when that access is cut off, how to protect devices, files, and system logs. And you also want to be careful to know when to call legal counsel to keep communications protected and when law enforcement needs to be involved. The idea being here is that you really want to be ready before something goes wrong and be considerate before something goes wrong, not scrambling afterwards. When it comes to exiting employees, we've discussed this a lot because it's one of the most significant risks. Departing employees are really one of the most common sources of trade secret exposure, and they're one of the most preventable. An employee walking out the door, they're no longer going to be at work. It is very visible. So you want to have an exit process that is thorough and not rushed. This means recovering all devices, which means that you need to be aware of all devices that the employee has in the first place. You want to remove access, and then you want to have a real conversation, like Jordan said, about continuing confidentiality obligations. Pay extra special attention to digital access. There's devices, but there's also cloud tools, shared folders, autosave credentials even that can be pretty easy to overlook. So don't assume that tech is being returned in a clean condition. Secure the hardware and keep a chain of custody and make sure that you use a effective and conscientious final inventory to help ensure that nothing walks out the door, either physically or digitally. Still, if your trade secrets are exposed or misappropriated, the next step can be and might have to be taking legal recourse, and that's what we're going to discuss in the final section of today. Even with the best internal controls, even with the best preventative measures, things can still go wrong, things happen. And that's why it's really critical to have a legal response framework ready. The next section is going to walk through what to do when you suspect a theft or breach of confidential information, from the internal investigation to what a potential legal action could look like. So we'll start out by looking at what your internal investigation might look like. When your suspicions arise, if something sort of piqued your interest from some of the factors we discussed before, when we're looking at employees, maybe fulfilling a few of those insider threat factors, time matters. So at that point, you need to make sure you're following your process and not rushing or mishandling the response, because that could potentially make things worse. You want to consider securing key data sources, emails, network drives, backups, so nothing is deleted or altered, and develop and ideally follow a really clear internal protocol for how these materials are searched. This avoids chaos, keeps the process defensible, and you want to keep these investigations really confidential and really compartmentalized. Only those who truly need to know should be involved. And finally, this is really important, but don't let the urgency lead to overreach. Be careful not to violate privacy laws or internal policies, potentially making things worse for yourself down the line. So where should you actually look? Next, we'll talk about some of the key sources of evidence that you can support or use to support or refute potentially your concerns. Technology, like I said, is always going to leave this trail. So that's a great starting point. Some of the obvious places are really the employee's workstation and their email accounts. See is there any information there that is determinative of potential trade secret or theft or misappropriation. But along with that, consider the less obvious sources. It might seem a little outdated, but voicemail systems could give away information, access card logs, call history, and surveillance footage. These are all information within your purview that could be useful. And the more sources you check, the better your ability are going to be to identify patterns and timelines that are going to be able to demonstrate what an individual is doing and might give you a better time frame for what's happened. But once you've gathered that evidence, the next step is really going to be evaluating, whether legal action is needed and how to respond without losing control of the narrative or getting rushed. So once you've identified a potential incident, you've conducted your investigation, you've looked at the digital source, be it theft of data or a breach, your initial response is going to be to either contain the damage or potentially make it worse. You want to make sure you're trying to contain the damage. So you want to start with a clear checklist, ideally developed prior to the breach with an incident response plan. What needs to happen? Ideally, which employees are going to own each step and in what order. Ideally, you'll identify what information was compromised and how much of your network or how much of your business might be affected. In doing so, you can preserve evidence, and that means like preserving security logs and system activity before they get overwritten. It's a common problem. If you think about security cameras, oftentimes they are overwritten sometimes 24 hours, sometimes within a week. But oftentimes it's a short turnaround. So it's really important that you identify where the evidence is quickly so that it isn't overwritten and you can recover it. You also want to document when and how the incident was discovered and make sure that there's a reliable internal reporting system. When it comes to conducting the investigation, ideally that's going to be under the direction of counsel. So you want to bring in legal counsel early. That helps to, one, coordinate the response strategically, but two, really importantly, protect privilege. Then you can use internal or third-party cyber experts to figure out exactly what was taken and how much, if applicable. And if necessary, you can seek an injunction under the Defend Trade Secrets Act or state trade secret laws. But that only works if you've taken the right steps to show the information was truly protected by what we discussed earlier in this presentation, be it covenants, be it agreements, being adequate steps to maintain the secrecy of those trade secrets. And when it comes to a civil lawsuit, so despite everything we discussed, at the end of the day, not every dispute can be resolved quietly or internally. And when the damage is real or the risk of loss is too great, civil litigation becomes your enforcement tool. And fortunately, the law does offer a range of remedies that you can use to protect your business and hold individuals accountable, sometimes on the short term, sometimes in the medium term, and sometimes just in the long term. You can bring tort claims like conversion or trespass for misappropriated property. You can use contractual breaches, especially of your NDAs or your employment agreements, to form the backbone of a lawsuit. If there's digital misconduct, then the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act adds another legal option you can utilize. And if trade secrets are involved, the Defend Trade Secrets Act allows you to, again, pursue injunctions and damages, sometimes even in federal court. So sort of in concluding this presentation, protecting trade secrets and sensitive information isn't just about legal compliance. It's really about preserving the innovation, trust, and competitive edge that can drive your company forward. So while it's tricky to keep ahead of all the potential risk, it's really important that you utilize the right planning, use smart policies and prepared teams, and you can reduce with the right planning, smart policies, and a prepared team. And if you're conscientious and considerate about refreshing, conducting training, then you can reduce action. And if you have to take action when it counts, you'll be ready to do so. So thanks so much for joining me today. Me and Jordan today. Really happy to take any questions now. We'll just go through a few updates on Come SEO Carry. Coming forward, these are a few special services we offer. There's the California Workplace Violence Protection Compliance Solutions. We have a record-keeping masterclass for OSHA, the OSHA Inspection Masterclass, the California Harassment Training Seminar. Jordan, you're going to go through of course. And then we also have the blogs, which we update weekly, the Employer Defense Report, the OSHA Defense Report, the Cal OSHA Defense Report, and the MSHA Defense Report, all providing you updates of the legal updates in these areas and what you can use to stay apprised of any updates that might affect your businesses. And then finally, in terms of upcoming events, we've got the California OSHA and the California L&E Law Summit coming up in Northern and Southern California in the fall. And upcoming, we have the Midwest Workplace Safety and L&E Law Summit in Detroit coming up in just 2 months in June. You should also tune into the Terms and Conditions podcast, recently started this year. Really good fun, really informative, and hosted by Letitia and Samuel. So you can check it out. It's accessible on a lot of major podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Amazon. So I think that's everything. I don't think there's any other podcast platforms I know. But
And Darius and I are always happy to speak with anyone via email or pick up the phone if you have any questions about this information. Otherwise, yeah, we'll look forward to talking to you soon at one of our future employment law webinars. Yeah, and otherwise, thank you very much for attending. We hope this information was informative, and we will see you on another webinar sometime soon.
All right. Thanks, everybody.